I heard the warning just 2 seconds before it happened. "They're cutting your mic." The words came from my left, a low, urgent whisper from a colleague sitting 3 seats down, watching with the expression of someone who could see an accident coming, but had no power to stop it. By the time I understood what was being said, the microphone in front of my face had already gone dead. I kept speaking for a moment out of pure instinct. The words left my mouth, prepared, specific, the words I had spent 14 months building, but they died somewhere between my lips and the empty speakers, absorbed by a silence the rest of the chamber had apparently been expecting. Then came the laughter. I had prepared for opposition. Opposition was professional. What I had not prepared for was the direction the laughter came from. Not from the benches across the floor. Not from the people who had disagreed with me in committee sessions and budget hearings. The laughter came from my own side. My party. My colleagues. People I had walked into this building with, believing we shared a purpose. They laughed with the easy comfort of people who already knew how the story ended, who had, I understood in that moment, already decided it before I stood up. My bill was not debated. It was dismissed before it had drawn a single breath. The committee chair's name was Honorable Marcus Dend, and he had a way of humiliating people that felt almost generous, as if explaining your inadequacy to you clearly was a favor. He leaned forward from his elevated seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked at me the way a professor looks at a first-year student who has confused confidence with preparation. "This proposal," he said, his voice filling the room with comfortable authority, "shows a fundamental lack of political understanding." The applause was immediate. Not loud, worse than loud. The soft, knowing applause of people who considered the matter settled before it was spoken. The cameras found my face. I had been told by experienced colleagues that cameras always find the person being reduced, not the person doing the reducing. The angle is more interesting. So while Honorable Dend received his applause and settled back with visible satisfaction, the lenses pointed at me, alone at my microphone, notes still open in front of me, arguments still alive in my head with nowhere to go. I did not flinch. I had decided before I walked in that they would not see me flinch. But I felt it, the cold, specific shame of being dismissed in public by people who had not done the work of understanding what you were saying. I sat there, silenced and surrounded, and I understood for the first time how completely alone a person can be in a full room. My name is Michael Reynolds. Who I was before this happened shapes everything about what came next. I grew up in Eastfield, a neighborhood that appeared in government speeches only as a statistic. Unemployment rates, infrastructure gaps, communities that officials referenced when they needed reasons to pass budgets, and then forgot about when those budgets disappeared into procurement processes nobody tracked. I watched that happen from the inside for 20 years. Roads promised and not built. Contractors arriving, collecting payments, completing partial work, and vanishing. Families paying taxes into a system that treated their neighborhood as an afterthought. I did not enter politics because I was ambitious. I entered because I was angry in a way that had nowhere constructive to go. I studied public finance, legislative process, and infrastructure policy, not because they were interesting subjects, but because they were tools I needed to do something specific, to close the space between government money and the people it was supposed to reach. I worked for 8 years in a research capacity before being elected. 8 years of reading contracts, attending budget hearings, building the kind of detailed knowledge that most officials never bother with because it is slow, unglamorous work with no cameras attached. I came to fix what everyone else pretended not to see. A person who truly understands a system is useful to the people it is supposed to serve. But they are dangerous to the people it secretly serves instead. That distinction was why they wanted me gone. After the session ended, I did not go home. I went to find Chief Baligan. I found him in the corridor outside the East Wing, speaking quietly to 2 men I did not recognize, suits, no identification lanyards, not parliamentary staff. They dispersed when they saw me coming. He turned with the unhurried calm of a man who had been expecting this conversation and already decided how it would go. Chief Baligan had brought me into politics. He had made calls on my behalf, arranged introductions, cleared early obstacles. He had told me more than once that I was the kind of voice the party needed, that honesty and preparation were undervalued, and that someone would eventually recognize their worth. I had believed him completely. "The bill," I said. I did not need more than that. He did not deny anything. He did not pretend surprise or hurt or confusion. He simply looked at me with the measured patience of someone who had run out of energy for pretending. "This isn't the right time for your bill," he said. His voice was calm. almost kind. The voice of a person delivering a verdict they considered final. I heard what he said, and I heard what he meant. The two were not the same. Not the right time implied a future possibility. What he meant was simpler and permanent. He meant not ever. I nodded once, turned, and walked away without another word. The punishment that followed was quiet enough that an outside observer might not have noticed it at all. That was entirely the point. Within 1 week of the failed bill presentation, I was removed from the Infrastructure Oversight Subcommittee, the one I had specifically requested when elected, the one whose work connected most directly to everything I had spent 8 years researching. The removal came through an administrative email. 3 lines. No explanation offered. The following week, I was not included in the Finance Review Committee meeting I had attended every session of for 14 months. When I contacted the committee secretary, I was told the attendee list had been revised. No further detail provided. My access to certain internal budget databases was quietly downgraded. I discovered this when a search I had run monthly returned incomplete results. The technical response, 4 days later, cited a routine access tier review. Meetings began happening without my knowledge. I heard about them from junior staffers, from overheard conversations, from the small telling silences that appear when you walk into a room where people have just stopped talking. None of it was dramatic. No confrontations. No official record of any action taken against me. Everything was deniable, each incident individually meaningless, collectively devastating. They were not just removing me from positions. They were dismantling the conditions that made my work possible, making me irrelevant without ever having to say so. I was fading quietly, like someone never supposed to have been there at all. The media coverage began within days of the session and built steadily over the following 2 weeks. I monitored it with the careful detachment of someone studying their own autopsy. The word that appeared most consistently was ambitious. It sounds like a compliment when read quickly, but paired with words like reckless and premature and politically naive, it became a diagnosis. This person wants things they have not earned the right to want yet. The narrative had a shape. A young, inexperienced legislator had overreached. He had brought a bill without building the necessary coalitions. He had mistaken his own certainty for consensus. His colleagues had been forced to step in before his ambition caused institutional damage. It was a clean, satisfying story. Clear protagonist, clear error, clear lesson. The only problem was that none of it was true. My bill had been specific, carefully researched, and financially sound. I had spent 14 months preparing it. I had reviewed it with economists, procurement specialists, and 2 former audit officials. The problems it addressed were real and extensively documented. But within 2 weeks, the Reynolds Bill had become shorthand in parliamentary commentary for legislative overconfidence. Journalists who had never read it used its name as a shorthand example of political immaturity. My own party had not just sidelined me. They had handed the media a story that made sidelining me look reasonable. They were not simply removing me from position. They were rewriting who I was. I want to be precise about what my bill actually contained, because people who opposed it were never precise about it. That gap between what it said and what it was claimed to say was where most of the damage lived. The bill was formally titled the Public Infrastructure Accountability and Verification Act. It proposed 3 specific mechanisms. First, mandatory independent verification for all infrastructure contracts above 50 million naira, requiring physical site inspection at each payment milestone before the next tranche could be released. Second, a public contractor registry with real-time ownership disclosure, including subsidiary structures, to prevent shell companies from receiving multiple contracts under different names. Third, criminal liability for procurement officers who approved payments without completing the verification process. It was not radical. Similar frameworks existed in 7 other countries with measurable reductions in infrastructure fraud. The research drew on work by 4 independent policy institutes over 11 combined years. They called it unrealistic. Chief Balagan, in a background briefing I heard about secondhand, had described it as the kind of thing that looks good on paper but creates more problems than it solves in practice. But I had not written it on paper. I had written it based on real procurement records, real contract data, and documented patterns of financial loss across 42 infrastructure projects tracked personally over 3 years. The bill was accurate. Every concern it raised was grounded in evidence. I was beginning to understand that accuracy was precisely why it had to be stopped. The crisis broke on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after my bill was dismissed. I heard about it first through a news alert, a headline about a national highway project in the Northern District. One of the government's flagship infrastructure announcements, featured in election materials and ministerial speeches for 2 years. The project had collapsed. Not metaphorically. Physically. A section of newly constructed road had failed structurally within 8 months of being certified as complete. An inspection team found foundations that did not meet basic engineering specifications, materials substituted without documentation, and significant portions of the project completed on paper, but not in the ground. The financial disclosure that followed was worse. Of the 4.7 billion naira allocated to the project, independent auditors could account for approximately 2.1 billion in verifiable expenditure. The remaining 2.6 billion had moved through the payment structure and disappeared into accounts and entities requiring further investigation. The contractors whose names appeared on the documentation were unreachable. Their registered offices, when visited, were vacant properties or addresses shared with multiple other companies that appeared to have no operational history. Every single thing my bill had warned about, the unverified milestones, the shell contractor structures, the payment releases without site confirmation, was happening, in exact detail, inside one of the country's most publicly celebrated infrastructure projects. The truth of everything I had said was written in a collapsed road, and 2.6 billion missing naira. The panic that followed was quieter than the crisis, which made it more interesting to observe. The public version was loud. Hearings announced, press statements issued, ministers photographed walking into emergency briefings with serious expressions and thick folders. The language of accountability was everywhere. We will get to the bottom of this. No one is above scrutiny. The full weight of the law. The theater of governance responding to failure. But I had enough contacts in enough corridors to hear the private version. And it was different in texture, in tone, and in the specific kind of fear running through it. The closed-door meetings happening were not primarily about how to fix the road or recover the funds. They were about containment, about which names could be kept from public reporting, about which aspects of the procurement trail were too exposed to manage, and which ones might still be quietly controlled, about how the story could be shaped so it ended at the project level and did not climb higher into the institutional structures that had made the project possible. The same people who had applauded when my bill was dismissed were now sitting together, trying to understand the limits of their own exposure. And for the first time since that corridor conversation with Chief Balagan, I watched the composure of those people develop visible cracks. The careful confidence that powerful institutions were like a second skin began to splinter. They were uncertain, and uncertain powerful people always do unpredictable things. The call came on a Tuesday evening, 10 days after the highway crisis broke publicly. I was at my desk, reviewing documents I had been re-examining since the collapse made the news, when my phone showed an unknown number. I had been receiving more press calls since the story broke. Journalists who had written about my bill's dismissal as an example of legislative immaturity were now, with impressive flexibility, reframing it as prescient and ahead of its time. I had declined every one of them. I answered this particular call because something about the timing felt different. The voice on the other end was male, controlled, institutional, the voice of someone who made important calls regularly and had stripped all unnecessary information from them. "Your bill," he said. "We need to revisit it." That was the entirety of the opening. No introduction, no name, no acknowledgement of the cut microphone, or the laughter, or the committee dismissal 3 weeks earlier. No apology, just urgency, the compressed, mechanical urgency of people who need something and have decided that needing it overrides the history of how they treated you before they needed you. I held the phone against my ear and said nothing for a long moment. I wanted whoever was on the other end to sit inside that silence. To feel, even briefly, the weight of asking something from a person you have already demonstrated you do not respect. "I will consider it," I said finally. Then I ended the call. That phone call clarified something I had been turning over in my mind since the highway project collapsed. I had spent the weeks after the bill's dismissal asking myself the wrong question. I had been asking, why did they block it? The answers I arrived at were unsatisfying: political competition, institutional conservatism, the general resistance powerful systems have to accountability mechanisms. All true, all partial, none of them quite reaching the root. The right question was different. Not why they blocked my bill. What they were protecting when they blocked it. A bill targeting inflated contracts and ghost companies is inconvenient for a government that values efficiency. But inconvenience does not produce the specific, coordinated response I had experienced. The cut microphone, the prepared laughter, the immediate committee removal, the media narrative assembled so quickly it could only have been pre-written. That level of response meant the bill was not inconvenient. It was threatening. Now the highway crisis showed me what it was threatening. Not a general culture of loose procurement. Something more specific, an active, organized system of financial extraction running inside public infrastructure spending, protected by the right authorizations and the right silences from the right people in the right positions. They had not blocked my bill because it was weak. They blocked it because it was accurate enough to expose something they could not afford to have exposed. And now the exposure was happening anyway, not through my bill, but through a collapsed road and 2.6 billion missing naira. They needed my help to manage what I had warned them about. After the phone call, I went back to my original research, but this time with completely different eyes. When I had written the bill, I had been building a policy argument. I was looking for patterns of systemic failure, evidence that the procurement framework had gaps requiring reform. That lens produced accurate findings but limited what I was searching for. I was looking for problems in the system, not for specific people making deliberate choices to exploit those problems. Now I looked again. I pulled every infrastructure contract I had ever reviewed and went through them not as a policy researcher, but as an investigator. I was not asking where the system was failing. I was asking who was benefiting from the failure and exactly how they were making it happen. I followed the contracts. Every major infrastructure project funded through the national budget across the past 4 years. I traced each one's complete procurement trail. Who submitted the bid? Who approved the shortlisting? Who signed the contract award? Who authorized each payment milestone? Who certified completion? I worked for 11 days, averaging 5 hours of additional research each evening alongside my official duties. 3 notebooks, a spreadsheet that eventually contained over 400 rows of data, and a growing clarity about what I was looking at. The pattern that emerged was not random. Not the messy, opportunistic decisions of many independent actors. It had structure. It had repetition. It had internal consistency across time and ministry boundaries. Something organized was operating inside these contracts. The more I looked, the more defined its shape became. The contractor network was the key. Across 14 separate infrastructure projects spanning 4 years and 3 different ministries, one set of contracting entities appeared repeatedly. Not the same company name. They were careful about that. The names changed with each project. Sovereign Build Group, then Apex Infrastructure Partners, then National Project Associates, then Cornerstone Development Consortium. Each presented itself as a distinct, independent company. But the structure beneath the names was identical every time. Registration documents, obtained through information requests and public registry searches, showed the same formation pattern. Each company had been incorporated between 8 and 14 months before winning its first contract, long enough to have a credible registration date, short enough that no real operational history could be expected or verified. Each listed nominee directors, names that appeared as company officers, but carried no other traceable professional footprint anywhere. Each had a registered address that was either a shared office service or a private residential property. Most significantly, payment documentation showed the same cluster of receiving accounts appearing across multiple companies. Different names, different contracts, different ministries of origin, but money flowing consistently toward the same financial destinations. This was not multiple independent fraudsters discovering similar methods by coincidence. This was one operation running under multiple identities, cycling through enough variation to avoid the pattern detection that a system like my bill would have triggered automatically. Someone was recycling fraud, using the same financial architecture over and over, protected by the gap between what the system could see and what was actually happening beneath it. I found it on a Wednesday afternoon, in the 14th hour of a research session that had started the previous evening. I had been working through approval documentation for a roads rehabilitation project certified as complete 18 months earlier, cross-referencing the internal approval chain against the contractor registration data I had assembled. The documents were dense. The connections required careful, patient reading. Then I saw the signature. It appeared on 3 separate documents within the same procurement chain: the contractor shortlisting approval, the contract award authorization, and the final payment certification. 3 separate approvals at 3 separate stages, all bearing the same signature. I had seen that signature before. Not in documents, in person. On letters, on formal correspondence, on the kind of written communication that comes from someone who has occupied institutional authority long enough for their signature to be recognizable. I pulled up a signed letter I had received 2 years earlier, during the period when I still believed our relationship was what I thought it was. I compared the two. Chief Balagan. My mentor's signature appeared on procurement approvals, authorizing payments to a contractor that was, by every measure I had developed across 11 days of research, a shell entity designed to extract government funds and redirect them into private accounts. He was not someone associated with this network through coincidence or negligence. His signature was on the documents that made it operational. He was not protecting the system from my bill. He was protecting himself from it. Everything changed when I confirmed that signature. Not emotionally. I had processed the grief of understanding who Chief Balagan actually was back in that corridor when he told me the bill was not the right time. I had done that grieving privately over several weeks. By the time I found the documentary evidence, the emotional reality of his betrayal was not new. What changed was the nature of the task in front of me. Until that moment, I had been operating as a person with a good policy idea, working to rehabilitate an unfairly dismissed bill, trying to restore credibility in a hostile environment. The goal was professional and personal. Prove I was right, get the bill reconsidered, repair what had been done to my reputation. That was no longer the right frame. What I was holding now was not policy research. It was evidence of organized financial crime inside government, connected by a documentary trail to a senior official who was currently positioning himself as part of the solution to the infrastructure crisis his own network had created. This was not about passing a bill anymore. This was about exposing something that had been running for 4 years, extracting money from communities like the one I grew up in, producing collapsed roads and missing billions while the responsible people attended parliamentary sessions and gave interviews about accountability. I needed to be careful. Moving too quickly would give them time to respond. Moving without sufficient evidence would allow them to manage the story. I needed more proof. And I needed it from inside. Her name was Adiz Nwosu, and she reached out through a method I did not immediately recognize. A message delivered through a third party, a junior staff member who handed me a folded note after a budget review session with the simple instruction that someone wanted to meet. The note contained a time, a location, and 3 words. I saw everything. We met in a small office on the 3rd floor of the administrative building, a storage room she had arranged access to through her procurement office role. She was in her early 40s, precise in the way of people who have worked in environments where small errors have large consequences. She looked tired, not from long hours, but from the specific exhaustion of carrying knowledge you do not know what to do with. I saw what they did to you, she said, after we had confirmed no one was nearby. The bill, the session, everything that followed. I waited. I did not want to direct her. I wanted to hear what she had chosen to say. I work in procurement processing. I have for 11 years. I have watched things pass through my office for 4 years that I knew were wrong. I flagged 3 of them through internal channels. Nothing happened. I stopped flagging. She paused, looking at her hands. But after the highway project collapsed, and after I watched them dismiss your bill, and then panic when everything your bill warned about came true, I decided I no longer wanted to carry this alone. She reached into her bag. I have something you need, she said. What Adiz gave me was not dramatic in its physical form. A folder of printed documents, an encrypted drive, and a handwritten index she had prepared to help me navigate them. But the contents transformed everything I already held. The printed documents were internal procurement processing files, originals, not copies. They covered 9 projects across 3 years, each file containing the complete internal approval chain. Initial submissions, internal review notes, approvals at every level, and payment authorization records. Adiz had marked specific pages with small yellow stickers, directing me to the anomalies she had identified through 11 years of professional experience. The encrypted drive contained something more significant: payment trail documentation, showing the movement of funds from government accounts through the contracting entities and into offshore accounts. This was internal banking correspondence that had passed through the procurement processing system as part of payment confirmation. It showed precisely where money went after it left government accounts. The offshore accounts traced to 3 jurisdictions, all chosen, I recognized immediately, for limited disclosure requirements and histories of use in concealing public sector financial flows. Most critically, Adiz had copies of internal memos signed, dated on official letterhead, in which the anomaly she had flagged had been reviewed and formally dismissed at the senior procurement oversight level. The signature on those dismissal memos was not Chief Baligan's. It was someone I had not previously connected to this. The network was wider than even 11 days of research had revealed. The evidence was real, internally consistent, and thoroughly documented. It was far bigger than I had originally thought. The invitation arrived through official channels, formal committee stationery, requesting my attendance at a closed-door working session to contribute to the government's response framework for the infrastructure integrity crisis. The language was careful and bureaucratic, the kind that carries no fingerprints. I accepted. I told no one why. The meeting was held in a conference room in the parliamentary annex, a room I had never been in before, chosen, I suspected, because it was unfamiliar territory for me. 7 people were present when I arrived. I recognized 5. The tone was precisely calibrated, somewhere between collegial and transactional. No acknowledgement of the bill dismissal. No reference to the cut microphone, the committee removal, or the media narrative. We were apparently beginning from a neutral baseline, as though the preceding 3 months had not occurred. 12 minutes into a presentation about the crisis scope, one of them said it plainly. "We need your help fixing this." He said it with the measured directness of someone who had rehearsed the sentence enough to remove all discomfort from it. The word choice told me everything. Not investigating, not prosecuting, not exposing, fixing. Meaning, containing the public damage while protecting the institutional structures that had allowed it to happen. I nodded. I said I was willing to contribute. I was not there to fix their problem. I was there to understand the exact boundaries of what they were trying to protect, and to confirm the final details I needed before using the stage they were, unknowingly, about to hand me. I played the role they had cast me in with careful attention for 11 days. I attended 2 more closed-door sessions, taking detailed notes on what was said and, more importantly, what was deliberately not said. I asked technical questions about procurement frameworks that were genuinely useful to them, and that also helped me confirm specific elements of the evidence trail I had been building independently. I contributed real analysis, grounded enough to be credible, general enough not to reveal what I actually knew. They were using me as technical cover, a way to demonstrate that their response to the crisis had involved genuine expertise, that someone with a clean public record on infrastructure accountability had been consulted, that the process was conducted in good faith. I understood this. I let them use me in that way because it kept me close and because it gave me something important, proximity to their thinking. I could hear which aspects of the network they were most anxious to protect. I could map the precise edges of what they were willing to sacrifice and what they were not. Throughout this period, I was communicating regularly with Adiz, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly authenticated and held in locations beyond the reach of anyone who might attempt to interfere if they suspected what I was preparing. I was not helping them manage their crisis. I was using their invitation to gather the final information I needed. And the closer they pulled me in, the less attention they directed toward what I was preparing on the outside. I was finishing something. They had, without knowing it, given me everything I needed to finish it well. The announcement of the National Emergency Infrastructure Accountability Session came from the Speaker's office on a Monday morning. It was presented publicly as the government's decisive response to the highway crisis, a full parliamentary session, open to the public, fully televised on the national broadcast network and streamed through official digital channels. Every senior official connected to infrastructure governance and public procurement oversight was required to attend. Media accreditation had been issued broadly. The session was scheduled for that Friday. The people who arranged it believed it would serve a specific purpose. It would demonstrate government transparency. It would allow senior officials to present their version of events, announce corrective measures, and absorb public concern within a structured format they controlled. It would look like accountability without producing it. What they had not accounted for was me. I had been included in the session planning as a technical contributor, the credible outside voice that gave the process legitimacy. I had a designated time slot. I had been asked to present a procurement reform framework I had prepared during the closed-door sessions. I had prepared it. It was genuine, detailed, and technically sound. But it was not the only thing I was bringing to that chamber. I had spent the 2 weeks since the invitation organizing everything. Adiz's evidence, My own research. The authenticated financial trail. Copies secured in 3 separate locations. They thought this session was damage control. I knew it was the stage I had been waiting for since the day they cut my microphone. I walked back into the main parliamentary chamber on that Friday morning, carrying a leather folder and the specific quality of calm that comes when you have prepared so completely that fear has nothing left to attach itself to. The chamber was full. The press gallery held more journalists than I had ever seen in it, domestic and international, the attendance a crisis of this scale naturally produces. The public viewing section was at capacity, people who had followed the highway collapse story and wanted to see the government's response firsthand. I took my assigned seat. I was on the same side of the chamber, roughly the same area, where I had sat 3 months earlier when my microphone was cut and my colleagues laughed. Some of those colleagues were present. I did not look at them with any particular expression. I looked forward at the podium and at the chamber layout, thinking about what was about to happen. Chief Baligan was seated at the senior officials' table near the front, in his full formal wear, projecting the authority of a man who considered himself the appropriate person to lead conversations about institutional accountability. As far as I could determine, he had no knowledge of what was coming. None of them laughed as I entered. They were waiting for a controlled, technically useful presentation that would help manage the optics of a crisis they believed was still manageable. The cameras were already rolling. The live stream was already broadcasting to the largest parliamentary audience in 3 years. There would be no cutting my microphone today. When my time came, I stood, opened my folder, and began. For the first 4 minutes, I delivered exactly what they expected. The procurement reform framework, prepared as requested, genuine, technically detailed, and sound. I presented it clearly, referenced international comparisons, and outlined an implementation timeline. The room was attentive. Everything appeared to be going as planned. Then I said, I would also like to formally reintroduce the Public Infrastructure Accountability and Verification Act, dismissed by this body 90 days ago. The chair looked up from his papers. As a matter of parliamentary process, I continued, a bill dismissed without substantive debate retains the right of reintroduction when new material evidence supports its provisions. I had confirmed that rule 7 times before the session. What I am attaching to this reintroduction is documentary evidence demonstrating that every mechanism proposed in the bill addresses a specific, documented, active pattern of procurement fraud, not theoretical risk, but a concrete, identifiable system of financial extraction operating inside public infrastructure spending for at least 4 years. I began distributing the evidence summary documents, sufficient copies for every official at the table, every committee member, and every journalist in the press gallery. People reached for the pages before I had finished distributing them. The room changed in the specific, unmistakable way that a room changes when it understands that what is happening is not what was planned. Real contracts, real losses, real names. The shift had begun, and there was nothing anyone in that chamber could do to stop it. I had thought carefully about the order of presentation. Order matters when delivering difficult information. You move from structural to specific, from pattern to person, giving each layer time to register before the next arrives. I began with the contractor network, the shell company structure, the recycled financial architecture, the registration pattern appearing identically across 14 projects over 4 years. A visual chart on the screen showed each company name, its registration date, its contract value, and its connection to the receiving account cluster. Several journalists stopped writing and simply watched. Then came the payment trail, documentation showing the movement of funds from government accounts into offshore structures. I had had this evidence independently verified by a former senior auditor who had reviewed it confidentially and confirmed its authenticity in a written assessment I also entered into the parliamentary record. The chamber had gone completely quiet by this point. Not the polite quiet of official proceedings, but the arrested, focused silence of people receiving information they cannot look away from. I moved to specifics. I named the amounts. I named the dates. I named the account references and matched them to the corresponding authorizations. I named the ministries where approvals had been processed. I named the officials whose signatures appeared at each stage of the procurement chains. And then, clearly, without hesitation, with the documentary evidence visible on the screen behind me, I named Chief Baligan. I heard the air in the chamber shift. The collective held breath of an institution, receiving something it had believed it had successfully prevented from ever arriving. Chief Baligan stood before I had finished speaking. Not a controlled response, a physical reflex, the body overriding the mind's better judgment. "This is fabricated," he said. His voice carried the shape of his usual institutional authority, but something in its substance had changed. "This individual has a documented record of pursuing a personal agenda against." "Honorable members," I said, with a steadiness that surprised even me, "the documents on the screen are originals, not copies. The procurement records carry parliamentary registry stamps visible in the top left corner of each page. The payment trail documentation has been authenticated by a former senior auditor of the National Financial Intelligence Office. Chain of custody documentation for all physical materials is included in the distributed packages." I paused 3 seconds. "The signature on the contract award authorization for the Norwest Highway project, which is under investigation for the loss of 2.6 billion naira, can be verified against the parliamentary signature registry on file since Chief Balogun took office." The document was on the screen. The signature was enlarged, positioned beside the registry comparison I had prepared. Chief Balogun looked at the screen, then at the room, then at nothing. The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes after all remaining explanations have run out, when denial becomes structurally impossible, when everyone in a room arrives at the same conclusion simultaneously. Then the noise arrived. Voices, movement, the fractured sound of an institution losing its footing all at once. It was over. By the end of that Friday, the first resignation had been submitted. By Monday morning, 2 more had followed, along with a formal announcement from the Anti-Corruption Commission opening independent investigations into procurement processes across 6 ministries. The Commission's statement listed, as primary evidentiary material, the documents I had submitted to the parliamentary session. On Wednesday, Chief Balogun was formally placed under investigation. The announcement was brief, a name, a status, a reference number. The procedural language of consequences beginning their slow, inevitable work. On Thursday, 3 arrests were made, nominee directors of 2 shell companies whose identities I had traced through registration documents and whose real roles Adi's internal files made unmistakable. The Public Infrastructure Accountability and Verification Act was brought to a full parliamentary vote the following Tuesday. It passed with full support. The same chamber that had cut my microphone 93 days earlier voted unanimously for a bill they had dismissed without debate. I stood at the podium after the vote was confirmed. The room was quiet differently than it had been on that first day. Not the amused, waiting quiet of people expecting to watch someone fail, but the attentive quiet of an audience that had learned to listen. "I wasn't blocked because I was wrong," I said. My voice held steady. "I was blocked because I was early." I paused. The truth does not expire. It waits for the right moment. This time, no one dared cut my mic. This time, they needed me. And this time, the truth had finally been given the room it always deserved.